This video is sponsored by War Thunder. At this point, I am sure Lethal Company is a game that hardly even benefits from an introduction. The game's sole developer, Icicles, was not unfamiliar with success with his previous games, but this instance was something else entirely. Upon its explosive success on social media, it managed to outsell multiple AAA games simply by its merit as something refreshing and more accessible. But despite all this, the game has a problem. As we quickly approach 1 year since the game's release, it has considerably mellowed in its popularity. But this trend is nothing new. Successful titles made by solo indie devs generally share this fate. But as someone who really enjoys Lethal Company, I wanted to ask myself, why did this happen? I think the easiest way to answer this question is to look at the game's Steam page, where we can see that the game is technically still in early access. Icicles described the game as technically finished, but still with near infinite potential. He further said he wanted player feedback on the game's difficulty and balance, and also aimed to make the game infinitely replayable. Though to be fair, he also said he wanted to finish the game in 6 months, which clearly hasn't happened due to the overwhelmingly large audience he clearly did not plan for. So, the answer to why the game's popularity has dwindled is simple. The game isn't finished. But is that a satisfying answer? Not really. Overall, I think Icicles has done a great job with the game and has done well to listen to how people feel about its design. But that doesn't mean it can't be improved further, of course not. And after I realized this, I got to thinking about what my ideal version of Lethal Company would be, and I want to use this video to talk about exactly what I mean by that. However, I think it would be pretty boring if my opinion was the only one being used for this analysis of the game, so I took to asking my community for help. To accomplish this, I made a Google form with 15 simple questions regarding the game and asked members of my community to fill it out. Hopefully, this will be a great way to gauge where the player base stands in regards to their thoughts on the game as a whole. In this video, I'm going to go through the responses to these questions and try to analyze why people felt the way they did, as well as share my thoughts on whether or not I agree with their consensus. After that, I will dedicate another section of the video to describing how I would fix all of the problems outlined by the responses, all in order to strive for an even better version of an already fantastic game. But before I dive into the responses, I want to make sure I put out a few disclaimers, mainly acknowledging some biases. First and foremost, Lethal Company is a game enjoyed by millions of people, but my form only got about 700 responses. Naturally, this means that there are not enough answers to accurately portray the feelings of the community as a whole, and I can only hope to achieve an approximation of that. The second bias to consider is that the vast majority of the people who bothered to fill the form are people who likely already like the game, which is not a bad thing, just something to take note of. I also think it's important to note that this video is analyzing the game from a very critical perspective, particularly the perspective of a skilled player who knows the game inside and out. To some, I wouldn't be surprised if this video seems entirely unnecessary, but to me this is something I'm very passionate about. If you aren't willing to engage with the premise of the video, or you simply disagree with my points, that's fine. This video is being made entirely in good faith, and I respect Icicles massively as a solo developer and think Lethal Company is a fantastic game as it is. Finally, one last thing, I want to clarify that the vast majority of this video was written during update v56, and in order to prevent myself from being immediately outdated when I release the video, I might have a section at the end talking about how v60 might have changed my thoughts that I've outlined throughout the video.
Fruit. And what does that make, ketchup?
Oh, brother, this guy stinks!
With the admittedly excessive preamble out of the way, let's go ahead and dive straight in to the questions. Question 1. Do you think the game punishes players too harshly relative to how difficult it is? If yes, is that a good or bad thing? Of the given options, 42% of players said that the game is overly punishing, but they actually prefer it that way. The other 38% said the game was not punishing at all, and finally 12% said that the game was both punishing and they did not like it. And for a quick FYI, which will apply to all of the subsequent questions, if you're wondering why this only adds up to 92%, it's because I gave people the option to answer other or not sure as well. When I asked people to explain why they felt this way, most said that the game is supposed to be punishing as it requires game knowledge, team cooperation, and heavy decision making for risk versus reward. I personally agree with this, as the game is not overly punishing unless your entire team dies, in which case you lose all of your things and will have to start over if you've gotten far into the game. Many also agreed that the punishing nature of the gameplay adds quite a bit to the horror factor, since the game is, of course, a horror game. But once a run gets into the 1,000 plus quotas and beyond, the punishment for losing becomes more and more severe because the run is longer. Most people obviously don't ever get that far into the game since they don't bother getting good enough at the game to do so. However, I do believe that good players should also be considered. This niche group would rarely lose a long run to any mistake of their own, which is why we need to talk about the second question. Question 2. Do you think uncontrollable RNG related deaths are good for the game? Of the choices, 60% said that RNG-related deaths are fun, but every death should have a counter. 18% said RNG deaths are fun in general, and the other 15% said RNG deaths are not fun at all. So 75% basically agree that RNG deaths are either not fun or are not fun unless they have a counter. I don't think these answers are all that surprising. When I looked through the detailed responses, the general consensus was that although the game is obviously aimed mostly at a casual audience, very few actually seem to enjoy deaths they have no control over. I totally agree with this sentiment. A random death could be really funny given the game's proximity chat, of course, but afterwards you just have to sit there and do nothing for the rest of the day, which is where the fun definitely wears off. Not only that, but if you're pretty far into a session, a random death you can't control could completely ruin the run that you have going, and at that point, it's not funny anymore. It's just annoying. Another important thing to mention is that certain interactions within the game will only be funny for so long. For example, stepping into the fire exit just to be greeted by multiple turrets and getting immediately lit up is pretty funny the first few times. But as you start to rack up hours on the game, the spectacle simply wears off. This is more of a conversation related to the longevity of the gameplay at this point, which is something else I'll also be talking about. But overall, I believe random deaths are funny, but I want to alleviate the moments that feel unfair to the point of frustration. Question 3. Do you believe the game has redundant or useless items and ship upgrades? If yes, is it a good or bad thing, and which ones? 65% said that there are redundant items, but it isn't a problem. 17% said that there are redundant items and it is a problem, and 14% said that all items and ship upgrades serve a practical purpose. Now, this question is the first time where my opinion almost completely deviates from the responses, and after reading the details, I genuinely think it's because most casual players don't even bother messing with the items and ship upgrades, or they just don't get far enough into the game to have money to buy them before they die. And to me, this almost feels like an inadvertent confirmation that many of the items are not only redundant, but that it is also a bad thing that they are redundant. The problem that me and others have with a lot of the items and ship upgrades is that many of them are either situational or almost entirely useless, even if they might be fun to try out once or twice. Considering that currency and inventory space is so valuable in this game, it isn't surprising how many people simply choose not to bring these things with them. Personally, I don't really like the idea of there being so many redundant items that are only fun to use a handful of times, and I would prefer if they had a consistent use since it would make the gameplay loop more varied and interesting, thus making the game more fun overall. One of my friends had a specific opinion I wanted to highlight in that it makes sense lore-wise for the company to be supplying its workers with items that seldom have practical use, because they don't exactly employ you for the best job in the world. However, that friend still believed that even seemingly bad items should have better use cases, and I agree with that. I'm gonna elaborate on this later, but for now, let's just move on to the next question. Question 4. Do you enjoy the game's limited inventory and weight system? 48% said that they enjoy the game's inventory and weight system, but that it could be adjusted. Another 41.4% said that they just enjoy it the way it is, and only 8% said they don't like it at all. And here we see a pretty interesting near 50-50 split, with a slight favor towards the side that thinks the system could be changed. Personally, I believe the inventory and weight system is one of the best aspects of the game, and I feel as if it is very well and intentionally designed around the 4-slot inventory and decreasing movement speed with added weight. However, this strict 4-slot inventory is partially responsible for the redundancy of the items in the game, as it is rarely more valuable to bring an item with you at the expense of an inventory slot. Obviously, you can very easily argue that the point of the limited inventory is to encourage decision-making on what you actually bring with you, but when most people are making the same decision, is it really well designed? In the end, the most popular solution that many people opt for is to use a mod that adds a slot for utility items, which would solve inventory, weight, and item redundancy problems all at the same time. However, I'm not sure if the solution should be that simple. The main issue is that I feel like this disrespects the integrity of the current system, and it's really only a decision that could be made by Seekers himself on whether or not he wants to completely overrule the strict system he painstakingly designed. Though, the numbers don't lie. Nearly 50% of players would like to see some change to the inventory and weight system. Before we move on to the next question, I'd like to take a brief moment to shout out today's sponsor, War Thunder. War Thunder is the most comprehensive vehicle combat game ever made that allows you to take control of over 2,500 planes, tanks, helicopters, and ships ranging from the 1920s all the way up to the modern day. The gameplay is extremely immersive, with realistic graphics and sound design, as well as vehicles that have been fully modeled, both internally and externally, as opposed to having plain old hitboxes. In fact, you get a detailed X-ray view of exactly what happens to the enemy. The game also has a ton of cosmetics to personalize your vehicles and multiple game modes which cater to both casual and hardcore experiences. With a community of over 70 million and counting, you could be the next to join. Sign up for free on PC, PlayStation, or Xbox using my link in the description or pinned comment, and you'll receive a massive limited time bonus pack. This bonus applies to both new and returning players who haven't played in 6 months, and it includes exclusive vehicle cosmetic Eagle of Valor, 100,000 Silver Lions, and 7 days of premium. Join now to immerse yourself in the historic world of War Thunder. Question 5. Overall, do you enjoy the gameplay loop, or is it too repetitive or boring? 57% of players said that they enjoy the gameplay loop, but it does get stale. 38.5% say that they enjoy the gameplay loop and it isn't boring at all, and only 1.7% said that they don't enjoy the gameplay loop, full stop. Most people agree that although the gameplay loop is fun and has an amount of replayability because of its random seeds, the game lacks depth and variety to a point where doing the same thing over and over again will eventually get boring. A few other people also noted in their detailed responses that the game is overly reliant on making your own fun with friends, which is not necessarily a bad thing, but this approach won't work for many people, and it doesn't work forever for most people. I understand that this question was very broad and was mainly meant to gauge how people felt overall. Obviously, a game can never stay fresh forever. Most people choose to solve this problem on their own by using mods. In fact, I would bet that a lot of the people watching this video right now play with mods. It's obvious that the solution is more depth and variety, but I'll elaborate on exactly what I would do in future questions. Question 6. Do you wish the game had more balancing for solo players? This one was more of a self-indulgent question, but I was surprised that an overwhelming majority of 75% agreed that the game should put more effort into offering a solo-tailored experience, whilst only 13% said that the game should stay exclusively designed around 4-player teams. Most agreed that although the game is meant to be enjoyed with friends, there should be no reason for the game to be as punishing as it is for those who like to play alone. You don't always have friends that are willing to play the game at the same time as you, and not everyone is willing to hop into a random lobby with strangers since it might be uncomfortable. Surprisingly, a decent amount of the elaborated responses were from people who enjoy playing the game solo like me. It's good to know that I'm not the only one who enjoys the gameplay loop enough to play at an inherent disadvantage, and it seems like most of us agree that it should be a bit easier for those who want to. Question 7. Would you enjoy if playing in harsh weather conditions rewarded players? This question is extremely specific, and the reason why is because I wanted to gauge opinions for a concept that I already had an idea for. To my surprise, 80% of people believed that there should be some kind of reward for playing days with harsh weather conditions, and only 16% thought that it should remain as a standard obstacle. To clarify my stance, I do believe that weather conditions as obstacles are good for the game, and it adds more variety and challenge to the gameplay loop. However, I don't like that sometimes you hardly have a choice on whether or not you get to go, especially later into the game where there are only a handful of viable moons for you to go to in the first place. I also believe that after a while, weather conditions kind of become obnoxious inconveniences and no longer really feel fun or scary to play around, especially when it comes to stormy and eclipsed on the harder moons. Question 8. Do you wish moons had more distinct variety in the way they look and play? For example, exclusive scrap, enemies, weather, design, and environmental hazards. Unsurprisingly, 82% said the moons should have more variety. Only 14% said that they're fine as they are. It's unanimous between me and almost all that participated in the forum that each moon should have more exclusive features in order to distinguish them from each other and freshen the gameplay loop. For the most part, we've already touched on this in previous questions, and the reason for the current lack of variety ultimately boils down to the fact that the game is unfinished. It's not like Icicles doesn't know that there should be more variety, and he plans on it in the future, so I don't think there's much more to be said. Question 9. Do you wish the quota/selling aspect of the gameplay had more depth? For example, selling at over 100% value or having more than 3 days to meet the quota. This is another question with pretty much a 50-50 split, and I honestly thought more people would agree with me in thinking that this area of the game could use improvement. 48.5% said that it could be expanded, whereas the other 47.3% are perfectly fine with it as it is. As it currently stands, you get 3 days to meet the profit quota and sell on the 4th day. On the first day, your scrap is worth 33%, on the second 50%, and on the third 77%. Finally, it sells at 100% on the 4th and final day. This current system is not exactly boring, but there's never any incentive to visit the company building outside of that set 100% rate on the 4th day, at least for the purpose of selling your scrap. Question 10. Do you find yourself avoiding or preferring certain moons, and do you care if the moons are balanced? For this question, I actually offered a few options as to what people could pick. The majority at 37% said that they do prioritize playing certain moons and wish that they didn't have to. 25% said that they do prioritize playing certain moons, but they don't care if they're unbalanced. In third place, we have 18% of players who do whatever they want, and finally, 15% of players did play whatever moons they want, but wished that they were balanced. So, overall, 52% want moon balance and 43% don't particularly care. based on people's explanations and my own personal experience with the game, it's evident that many avoid offense, Embryon, and Dine like the plague. Less experienced players tend to avoid the higher tier moons entirely, as the average player will be able to get completely adequate value out of the free ones because some of them are kind of busted. People who know more about the game will also tend to avoid experimentation and march for various other reasons. And at this point, we've come upon many valid reasons to avoid engaging with most of the game's moons. It was honestly fairly difficult to properly evaluate exactly why people feel the way that they did, though. On one hand, many did distinctly avoid certain moons because the risk versus reward factor simply isn't rewarding enough, and I wholeheartedly agree with this sentiment. Though, on the other hand, it seems like many ignore certain moons simply because they either don't feel like learning them or perceive them to be too difficult, and I personally don't fully understand this mindset. Question 11. Which enemies, if any, do you believe are unbalanced? Now this is a very fun one, and I won't read every answer because I listed every enemy in the game, but I want to highlight a few of them. First of all, 23% said that all of the enemies are already balanced. I honestly didn't expect this many people to think that all of the enemies were balanced, and I personally lean towards this answer. Let's go ahead and take a look at the outliers. Everyone's favorite Forest Keeper or Forest Giant is the agreed upon least balanced enemy, with 24.5% saying that it's a problem. The Ghost Girl trails pretty close behind at 23%, and from there it drops a bit with the Kidnapper Fox at 17.5% and the Coilhead at 15%. The last few that are still above 10 are the Old Bird at 13.1%, the Earth Leviathan at 12.1%, and the Jester at 10.7%. First off, I don't think those bottom three I just mentioned are unbalanced. The Old Bird, the Worm, and the Jester all have intuitive counterplay, and the Old Bird and Jester are obviously inconvenient and difficult, but they show up on the harder moons they are meant to be. Moving on to the ones that I think are unbalanced, the Kidnapper Fox is the first primary outlier because its high number can partially be attributed to being a new enemy people aren't used to. However, this does not mean it's balanced. In fact, I think it's kind of terrible, especially in conjunction with how the Vein Shroud functions. The Giant is also pretty self-explanatory, as it is one of the most common enemies to encounter and is pretty hard to deal with even if you know what you're doing. Their main counter are stun grenades or the radar booster, but as we found out earlier, many people don't engage with store items in general. This, combined with the rather unintuitive details of Giant mechanics, makes for a perfect recipe of an enemy that people don't understand and die to fairly often. Do I personally think Giants are unbalanced? Not really. I do think the game could do a better job at communicating just how effective stuns are against them, because the Bestiary entry really only scratches the surface in regard to how they actually work. This is a problem I think many of the entries have, since that's really the only way that you can figure out how to counter an enemy without trial and error or a friend who already knows how they work. More detailed entries for certain enemies that currently lack detailed entries would be the best way to inform players on how to deal with them, which would help massively in bringing down the amount of people that believe some of the enemies are unbalanced. Now, with all of that being said, no enemy is more emblematic of the issue I just described than the Ghost Girl. Because she is a ghost, she doesn't actually have a Bestiary entry, despite being one of the most comically detailed and extremely misunderstood enemies in the entire game. On top of that, she doesn't really have a counter, even if you do know how she works. The only hard counter to the Ghost Girl is to stand in a position where she cannot spawn since she needs space behind you, and this is a pretty niche piece of knowledge to have and only works if you are the one that is haunted by her. It's honestly no wonder that 23% of people that answered the survey think that she's unbalanced, despite her not actually being a big deal the moment you know how she works. Overall, I think the game's enemies are mostly balanced, and I really don't think it would take much to fix them for the average player, but I'll talk about that later. Question 12. Do you think the game focuses too much on adding hostile enemies, and would you prefer to see more passive entities being added? 56.5% said that the game basically needs to continue focusing on adding hostile creatures, but that it wouldn't hurt to have more passive ones. The other 35% said that they would prefer if the game focused on adding passive creatures. The other 8% didn't seem to care or wanted a balance of both, which is, in retrospect, an answer choice I probably should have included. I do think that the game does kind of need to continue adding hostile creatures, because generally that is a major appeal for returning or new players upon the release of an update. However, I think adding more passive entities would benefit the game greatly. It would be awesome if the worlds felt more organic and had more life that you could interact with, even if they aren't a danger to you or don't specifically help you in any way. I think it would be interesting if there were even entities that specifically did help you, which would add to the depth and variety of the gameplay. Anyways, the reason why this question was even present in the form was because I had a fear that the constant status quo to add more hostile enemies would eventually bloat the game, making it continuously harder to enjoy as a player and harder to balance as a developer. However, I wanted to highlight a specific explanation that really helped me understand why my fears are unwarranted. It says, it's heavily RNG based, adding more entities just adds more possibilities. It doesn't feel bloated because it's not like you'll encounter every single creature at once. I've gone whole quotas without seeing anything, and some where a bunch of stuff shows up. And I honestly had never thought about it this way. Ultimately, it's all up to the fine-tuning and balancing of these mechanics and spawn chances to make sure the experience stays smooth. Questions 13 and 14. Overall, do you think Lethal Company is a good game? And what changes would you make to Lethal Company if you could? 57.4% said that the game is good but could use some changes. 38.7% that the game is just good, period. And only 1.5% said that the game is not good but could be with adjustments. Finally, less than 1% said the game is straight up bad, which is certainly reassuring. Based on the way people responded to the other questions, and also acknowledging the bias I already mentioned, it's not hard to see why most people think the game is already great. If it wasn't made evident by my previous statements, I agree with the majority wholeheartedly. The elaborations mostly said that adding more variety to the game is the key factor in making it better than it already is, with pretty much everyone else citing improved balance as being the rest of the equation. A few other things of note people said were more solo content, improved progression, and more quality of life features, with which I agree. Question 15. Do you have any remaining thoughts I didn't have a question for? The purpose of this question was to try to catch anything that I might not have made a question for, so I wanted to list some responses to this that I found interesting. Some people said that adding rare lore rooms to the random generation of the facility would be cool, a campaign or story mode, upgrading the size of the ship itself to allow room for more furniture and equipment, and different game modes or difficulties such as hardcore, or an easy mode. These are all cool suggestions, and I wouldn't be surprised if a lot of these got implemented at some point, but I won't be elaborating on what I would do with any of these concepts, since it doesn't have much to do with balance or the state of the game. It would just end up being vague speculation. So, now that we've gone through the responses and are hopefully all on the same page, I can propose how I would fix all of the things we just talked about. In this section, I will address gameplay loop and quality of life, moons, enemies and hazards, items and upgrades, and the solo experience. Kicking it off with general gameplay loop and quality of life changes, in the survey most people agreed that although the gameplay loop is fun, that it gets stale over time. This can ultimately be blamed on a lack of variety and replayability, which comes from the game not giving the player enough things to engage with. So how do we fix that? Obviously, moon variety is one of the major things, but discussing it is a bit difficult, since that facet of the game requires creative solutions that are undoubtedly already being worked on. However, I do have a few vague suggestions. More types of scrap and scrap exclusive to certain moons. Moon exclusive enemies and interiors. More moon types and rare tiles that can spawn in the facility that either have great loot, lore significance, or perhaps both. Possibly my favorite idea, which I did not actually come up with, is scrap bounties. Every quota, the company could have a list of certain scrap that will be bought by them for a marked up price. It would then be your job to identify what this is and where you can find it. And if you do find it, you'll get more money than you otherwise would have. I also would like to add a new section to the terminal to go along with this, the scrap list. This will allow you to look up the value range of scrap as well as where it is most common after you've scanned it once. This addition would be in an effort to make scrap bounties an accessible feature that doesn't force the use of a wiki for people who don't feel like memorizing information. If you combine this idea with the concept of adding a moon exclusive scrap, I think it could work extremely well. It would encourage going to all moons rather than the established best ones, as long as the reward was made to be adequate. It would also make for a very satisfying feedback loop for the player when they experience the joy of finding the specific thing they were sent to look for. All this doesn't even consider potential efforts towards adjusting the general moon balance, which will be what the next section is about. Next, I think the buy value percentage of the company should be random and capable of going over 100% all the way up to 125. In order to balance this feature, the final day of the quota would of course always be 100% sell value. That way you don't get screwed over by deciding not to hop on any particular one that you saw during the days. This feature could also be combined with perhaps certain quotas not only having 3 days to be done, but I don't know how exactly I would change this. I think the most obvious answer would be to scale the amount of days you have depending on how high the quota is, but people already play really long runs with the 3-day limit, and that feature might be just as boring as the current one is. So, truthfully, I don't know how I would change the amount of days, if even at all. To address the issue of weather, I think scrap prices should scale multiplicatively depending on the severity of the conditions. This rewards skilled players for purposefully seeking out Stormy and Eclipsed, but does not punish casual players when they have no better choice but to visit a moon with an inconvenient weather condition. Because of the fact that it's a multiplier, it won't be very effective on moons with cheaper items where the weather is not a huge factor in adding to its difficulty. My proposed modifiers are an extra 10% value for rainy and foggy, 15% for flooded, 25% for stormy, and 33% for eclipsed. Now, I am certainly willing to acknowledge the fact that this solution may be a bit too rewarding and is rather plain. It's probably not in line with something Seekers would actually do to the game. If you instead opted to take a more conservative approach at making weather more fair, I think a solution in line with that philosophy could be some kind of weather radar ship upgrade that tells you what the weather will be ahead of time. Another idea I had to make weather rewarding in a more creative fashion would be to have weather exclusive events or enemies or scrap spawns that are exclusive to certain weather conditions. Either way, I do genuinely believe some kind of reward or at least a band-aid on the inconvenience currently present in the game would be pretty nice. The last suggested gameplay change I think would be honestly pretty funny is if enemies were capable of being killed by mines and spike traps. I wouldn't do this with turrets since it kind of makes sense for them to be able to identify whether or not something is a player. It seems like pretty advanced technology. However, the mines and spike traps seem to just look for weight or something being under them, so I think that would make more sense. In general, I think this change would make the environment, enemies, and players interact with each other in more ways, and it would also be really funny, which this game is already pretty good at being. In terms of quality of life changes, I think the scan terminal command should accurately display the scrap value of everything outside of the ship, rather than the current approximation. On top of this, I think it would be great if there was another command, maybe called scan ship, which would display the total value of everything inside of the ship. Basically, this would be fixing the scan command and incorporating the ship loot mod into vanilla, which realistically should really be in the game. I also believe that store-bought items like shovels, flashlights, and lockpickers should be scannable when they're on the floor so that they can be found easier. I don't know why this isn't already a mechanic. I have lost items on the floor when fighting snare fleas that have gotten on my head or dropping them into outside shrubbery, and I really can't think of a reason as to why they should not just be scannable. As a side note, I think the scanning mechanic in general is a little bit janky, especially once you have a lot of stuff on the ship. However, I don't know how I would fix this, as the current system seems to be in place as a performance optimization or maybe to avoid clutter on the screen, but I figured I would mention it either way. Next, I want to address the moons from both a gameplay and design perspective. Experimentation has a very specific role as the beginner moon, with low scrap counts and values, as well as easy enemies and a simple landscape. I have no issues with it at all. It's excellently designed. In regards to Assurance, I used to have more issues with it, but Seekers has actually nerfed it since then, and I believe it is now in a much better state. Rather than nerfing Assurance, I think it and Vow should be used as the baseline balance to adjust everything else around. Vow has a decent amount of fair value scrap alongside high chances for Bs. On average, Vow actually has slightly more loot than Assurance, but it is more dangerous and has a less convenient exterior. So like I said, I want to keep them as they are because I believe they are very well balanced relative to each other already. From a game design perspective, Vow also serves to explicitly introduce the player to giants and brackens, which are very common here. On top of all of this, the map design is very unique in that it's very hilly and introduces players to the collapsible bridge, which shows up again on Adamants. Overall, I believe Vow has a very deliberate role in the game, and I don't see any reason to change it either. Now, we move on to Offense, which has been pretty obviously the worst free moon for a long time. It seems like it was meant to be a high-risk, high-reward moon, but I think it honestly fails spectacularly at that by simply being too little reward for too much risk. On top of that, the fire exit is also extremely inconvenient unless you do a skill jump at the beginning of the day, and in general, Offense has one of the largest, slowest, and least efficient exteriors. Seekers has made an effort to fix Offense in the past by changing the loot pool, but it basically just went from worse to bad. I even recently played a run that I only went to Offense on just to determine how good or bad it really was, and I really did not have fun. The large exterior combined with dangerous enemies and high hazard counts simply make it not worth going to in pretty much any scenario. As it stands, the top 62% of the Offense loot pool is inhabited exclusively by items I wouldn't even put above C tier, which is insane for a moon this challenging and inconvenient. Although some higher tier items, such as the magnifying glass, clown horn, and air horn, are more common here relative to other moons that are free, it doesn't make up for the fact that most of what you're likely to find is literal garbage. In order to fix this, I believe the loot pool needs a complete overhaul. Less of the cheap heavy stuff and more of the already present good items. Perhaps new middle tier double-handed items could be added to generally inhabit the loot pools of higher tier free moons, but especially Offense. Rather than being in the 20 to 50 range like the engines, axles, and bottles, it could be instead something like 40 to 75, which is still pretty far below the averages you see on stuff like lamps and paintings. On top of that, I believe adding bees to the outside would also help give it some more of the value it desperately needs, which would also encourage players to venture into the outer parts of the exterior, giving that space some actual value. Bottom line, if you want a moon to be this challenging, it should probably not be terribly unprofitable relative to its safer contemporaries. Moving on to March, this is another one that I think is in dire need of being readjusted. It basically has the same problems as Offense, but just not nearly as severe. To clarify, I really like the idea of March having 3 fire exits and having a really large interior to balance the idea. It's a genuinely great concept, and it's the only moon in the game which offers that kind of nuance, which is why it's honestly such a shame that in practice the 3 fire exits will often spawn really close to each other, which completely ruins the whole idea. Not only that, but the scrap density, meaning how big the map is relative to how much scrap there is abysmal. To put it into perspective, the loot count and quality is similar to Assurance, but the interior is twice as large on a moon that is way more dangerous. It just doesn't make any sense. So I think changes would be very welcome. My proposed changes are as follows: increasing the scrap count dramatically from an average of 14.5 to an average of 18.5, making it so the 3 fire exits are guaranteed to spawn far away from each other, and making it so at least one beehive is always guaranteed to spawn somewhere on the map. Moving on to adamants, it's kind of in a weird spot. It does have some decent loot, but the exterior is so hard to navigate, and the enemies get so overwhelming towards the end of the day. It is pretty good to play with a jetpack, but by the time that you have a jetpack, why would you even be playing adamants for more than like 1 or 2 days? The way that I would change adamants is by making it have a little bit more loot and maybe toning down the low quality heavy items and making the chemical jug even more common. It could also include some of the mid-tier double-handed items that I mentioned earlier, which currently don't exist. It might also be a good idea to tone down the spawning curve for the exterior of the map because it gets overwhelmed with baboon hawks so quickly, and it's just another reason why navigating the exterior without a jetpack sucks. In regards to Ambient, I don't actually really think it's meant to be a moon you really want to go to, but it was recently buffed in V56, and it's honestly not terrible now. Either way, I think it's mainly there for the story and spectacle of the old birds, and it serves that purpose perfectly. Moving on to the paid moons, we have Rend, and I actually don't think I would change a thing about it. This might seem weird to some of you that know that Rend is pretty much the best moon of this set of 3, but the reason why I don't want to change it is for the same reason why I didn't want to change Assurance or Vow. I would rather balance everything around this baseline than make it any worse than it is. Dine, on the other hand, has been underpowered relative to its counterpart Rend for basically forever. Hey, this is Minaxa in editing. I realized while making the video that my understanding of Dine was pretty much just objectively incorrect, and it's actually even worse than I thought it was. Originally, I was under the assumption that the loot pool for Dine was a little bit better than Rend's. I was wrong. The loot is actually worse, and the only benefit that it has from a loot perspective is that there's a little bit more of it. But the average price is almost exactly the same, so the only real benefit that Dine has over Rend is that the fire exit is closer to the ship. Everything else about it is just worse. So if it were up to me, I would make Dine have 3 extra scrap on average, going from 23.5 to 26.5. I would decrease the indoor power from 16 to 14 and decrease the maximum turret count from 18 to 10 and the maximum mine count from 35 to 25. However, the average for both would stay where they are at 3 and 8. Now you may be wondering how buffing Dine would affect Titan, and I have some interesting thoughts regarding this. I've found that over time, the position that Titan held as being a high-risk, high-reward moon has progressively decreased with updates adding more enemies, hazards, and nerfs to the scrap count. In older versions, Titan had no turrets, no masked or nutcrackers, and way more loot. However, it has to be considered that Titan is no longer meant to be the final moon, now Artifice is. So as it stands, I think it only really needs to be a little bit better. To do this, I would increase the scrap range from 28 to 31 to 29 to 34. Just a little bit better. Map size multiplier would be decreased from 2.2 to 2.0 since I think the map being that large is kind of unnecessary, and I would make it so that the fire exit is guaranteed to spawn pretty far from the main entrance considering how big the map is. I would also decrease the maximum turret count from 35 to 25 and keep the average the same, just like I said before. As a very, very minor change, I would also fix the length of the information on the terminal so that the weather can be seen without actually typing in the moon's command. I'm fine with other aspects of Titan's design, like how many enemies can show up and how overwhelming it can get inside during the later hours. Even the fact that old birds can actually spawn here outside as well on Dine with relative frequency is totally fine. The whole point of Titan is the fact that all of the loot can just be dropped down from the top, and it's extremely convenient as an exterior. It is pretty much what offense wants to be, a great instance of risk versus reward. I just wanted to make the reward a bit better and the risk a bit lower. And finally, last but not least, we have Artifice, and I think Artifice actually does a great job at being the best map in the game. Although the scrap count is only marginally better than Titan after the changes that I proposed, the quality of the loot is much, much better than Titan's. I don't think the outside or inside enemies need to be made any easier or different than they are. The moon is mostly meant to be played with TZP Inhalant and a jetpack and maybe a cruiser if you're a psychopath, and I think that's pretty cool. The only change I would make to Artifice is guaranteeing that the fire exit spawns far from main, since it also is a large map. And this would make it so that your team can actually effectively gain loot instead of having entrances possibly be right next to each other. There are also a few miscellaneous changes I would make to every moon in the game that I believe would make the game more interesting in general. This first one is a little controversial, but I think it would be cool if gold bars had small chances to be found on every moon instead of just experimentation, march, and artifice. It would basically act as an elusive but expensive item that you can get super hype over if you happen to find it on a place where it's not common. Another thing that I have actually already mentioned a few times is the fire exit spawning close to the main entrance. I think it would be nice if this didn't happen on any of the moons. It's mostly a problem on the ones with super large interiors, but it would be so nice if you started on two sides of a giant maze instead of the fire exit just appearing next to the main entrance, and this happens not that infrequently. On a similar note, I also have issues with the way the game handles loot distribution, especially on the factory type interiors. Loot does not even attempt to spawn in the maze part of the factory, instead spawning in a large spherical radius around the larger rooms and catwalk tiles, and I think this is kind of dumb, since the maze often makes up a large amount of the map. I like the fact that traversing the maze is sometimes necessary to get to further parts of the map, as it adds to the player's decision making on whether or not they believe going down it is worth the trouble. However, I often find that traversing the maze on larger maps can result in finding a whole lot of nothing and not even leading to a room, which just wastes time. To fix this, I would just make it so loot can spawn in the maze, even if it's less common than the other tiles. Hey, editing Minaxa here. I just realized that the reason why this doesn't already happen is probably because the maze has a lot of dead ends and is a lot harder to explore and fully clear than the other tiles within the game. So I'm not sure if this is possible, but the way that I would solve this is by having the game draw a path from the start of the maze to all of the other tiles where stuff actually is, and only placing scrap along that path so that it actually leads you towards other tiles. And if you find scrap in the maze, it might tell you that you're going the right way and not getting lost towards a dead end. The mansion interior doesn't really have this problem because loot can spawn on all of the tiles. However, I've had many problems with the way loot tends to spawn in the kitchen. Fancy lamps tend to spawn physically inside of the cabinets rather than on top of them, and sometimes they spawn underneath the tables as well. In many cases, this definitely unintentional quirk of the loot spawning actually makes these items completely irretrievable without utilizing a clipping bug involving the extension ladder, which is obviously very frustrating and should not happen. There's a few other places in the game where items spawn in spots they probably should not be, and these have been in the game for a while, so I'm really hoping stuff like this gets fixed. Now it's time to talk about enemies and hazards. And when I say hazards, I'm referring to turrets, mines, and spike traps, all three of which I believe are actually very close to being balanced and fair. My only issue with them is when they spawn in the same room as an exit, which doesn't really have any counter aside from just reacting fast enough. So if it were up to me, I'd make it so hazards can't spawn in the same tile as an exit. That's it. Every other aspect of hazards can be countered by either having a flashlight to see in the dark or by having a terminal person, and not having either of these things is a conscious decision the player must make and potentially get punished for. In regards to enemies, there's a few miscellaneous changes I'd like to make, but first, we're gonna have to talk about the ones that topped the polls. The Kidnapper Fox, in concept, is a very cool enemy. The main problem is that the Vein Shroud, which is where it spawns from, is really annoying as a mechanic, and it can also spread to certain parts of the map that are inaccessible and also can spawn under the ship, meaning that the foxes can spawn basically right next to the place you're guaranteed to be. And I really just don't fundamentally agree with the way that the fox is handled currently. I think that the Kidnapper Fox should have less health so that it can be dispatched by a player with a shovel a little bit easier, and the Vein Shroud should also spread slower and break faster, instead of taking like 3 or 4 sprays from the weed killer to get rid of just one of them when there are often a dozen. Moving on to the Giant, I actually think they're pretty close to being balanced, but I said that earlier. The main issue I have with them is that they can see you from really far away, and they're very persistent once they've seen you for the first time. The way I would fix it is by decreasing the range at which they can spot you and also significantly increase the time it takes for them to give chase and decrease the amount of time it takes for them to lose interest after you hide. On top of that, it could be cool if the Giant couldn't see you at all if you were crouched and standing perfectly still. However, this could be a bit too easy. Hopefully those ideas would make it feel a bit more fair to play against giants while not completely taking away from what makes them a threat to begin with, especially considering how strong stuns and kitchen knives are already against them. For the Ghost Girl, my main issue is that she doesn't have a bestiary entry telling new players what to do, but obviously it wouldn't make sense to give her one because she's a ghost. You can't even scan her, at least I think. One solution I thought would be interesting is if the Ghost Girl actually had voice lines. For example, if she spawns behind you and you start looking at her, maybe she could say something along the lines of "look away" or "turn around" or something like that. Basically, any explicit indicator of the fact that you're not meant to look at her would immediately make her no longer an issue. Finally, we have the Coil Head, which I think is actually balanced and is just meant to be an extremely difficult enemy to deal with. Not only do they get stopped for a long time by doors, but stuns are also pretty effective against them as well. But one thing I think is kind of dumb is their ability to cross the gap jumps in the factory interiors, since you pretty much have to just like turn around to make sure you don't die to the fall. If you're an insane gamer, you can maybe do it, but I'm not sure if they should be able to cross those gaps, instead trying to find a way around, or at the very least they should be much slower on those gaps. And aside from that, I think they're fine. Lastly, one minor change I would make that I think would go a long way is making it so that brackens and slimes don't camp entrances. I have died to this multiple times from both enemies, and it's basically impossible to counter without just not using the door. Obviously, you can see nearby activity detected or whatever, and you'll know that you probably shouldn't go in, but sometimes you kind of just need to go in order to keep playing the game, so I think it just shouldn't be able to happen. For our second to last section, we will be tackling items and upgrades, and I actually have quite a few ideas on how to improve this facet of the game. I am mostly fine with the items in the game having more niche use cases, like the boombox or the spray paint. However, I think ultimately the best way to solve the problem of feeling like items aren't worth sacrificing a slot over is to add another slot. And I know I denounced this earlier, and in the past I would have said that this was a bad idea and that the integrity of the 4-slot inventory should not be compromised at all costs. But as we've learned today, half of the players in my survey think that changes to the inventory system would be a good idea. The way that I would personally accomplish this in the most balanced way possible would be a purchasable tool belt that can only hold small utility items. Not only would one of these have to be purchased for every player that wants one and repurchased if you lose it, but it would would also add an extra 10 pounds of weight to constantly slow the player down, not including the weight of the utility item. I believe all of these specific properties would prevent the tool belt from being something that trivializes the existing decision-making involved in what you want to take with you, which is the idea I believe should be preserved no matter what. If this tool belt existed, it would single-handedly buff all of these listed items in one go, while simultaneously improving the general experience by more freely allowing for nuanced gameplay with the items. Another thing that I think is desperately in need of a fix is the recently introduced company cruiser, otherwise known as a $400 waste of your time. Listen, I like the idea of the cruiser, I really do, and I like the way it controls and functions within the game, but my problem is that it traverses so poorly over the mostly rough terrain of pretty much every moon exterior that it's almost impossible to get any practical use out of. 99% of the time, running items on foot or using a jetpack is going to be a far better option, and the jetpack doesn't even cost twice as much as it. All it needs to be good is to not take damage as easily and have its physics interactions with map geometry adjusted, and it would work perfectly fine. But as of now, I personally find it to have almost zero practicality, and it gets boring to use after like 2 tries. I also want to briefly address the 3 store items that all have multiple uses, which are the spray can, TZP inhalant, and the weed killer. I think the weed killer is fine as it is, and I'm glad Zeekers made it have a use with the cruiser as well as to get rid of the vein shroud, of course. I do think it would be nice if the weed killer had more uses before you run out, since it's not the cheapest thing in the world and it's almost necessary when the vein shroud is around, which is not very convenient. The spray can is the one that would benefit the most out of this list from being held in the tool belt that I proposed. It doesn't really need any adjustment. But in regards to the TZP inhalant, to me it feels a bit too expensive for how little use you actually get out of a can. So if it were up to me, I'd make some simple changes and knock down its price to 90 from 120 and just give it some more juice before it runs out. Another thing I'm sure anyone who's played the game for more than 5 minutes has noticed is that a lot of the scrap in the game weighs more than it feels like it's supposed to. I personally don't have an issue with this idea on its own, since it's just a game and it doesn't have to be realistic, but does the yield sign really need to weigh that much? It's so bad that I'm not even sure if it's intentional, but it's been that way for so long. I don't even pick them up anymore unless they're worth like more than 30 and close to an exit. I can't possibly tell you why an item with an average value of 27 weighs more than every single thing in the game aside from the 2 most valuable pieces of scrap. If it's gonna weigh that much, it needs to either do more damage or be worth more. If not, then it needs to be a similar weight to the stop sign and just be a cheaper version of it. I know that this rant was a minor nitpick, but someone had to say it. The yield sign has gotta change. There are also 2 items in the game that I'm not 100% sure even have a place without being completely overhauled, and that would be the zap gun and the loud horn. Unfortunately, they both share a common trait in that there are other better and more convenient versions of these items that exist in the form of the stun grenades and the signal translator, and it essentially makes the other ones useless. To put it into perspective, the loud horn costs 100 credits and can be used to communicate with people indoors by assigning the sound an arbitrary meaning. The signal translator only costs another 155 credits and can globally convey specific messages under 10 characters to everyone simultaneously. It is literally just a better version of the loud horn that is only a little bit more expensive. The zap gun, on the other hand, is extremely expensive already. It costs 400 credits, and all it really does is stun enemies for a brief period of time. And this period is so brief that unless you're using it on a low tier enemy like a hoarding bug, you're probably not gonna get much value out of it. And for it to cost that much and basically just be worse than a stun grenade or a radar booster is kind of just insane. If you wanted to take the approach of not changing their mechanics, then they just need to be made drastically cheaper so that they can be bought much earlier relative to their convenient alternatives. And if not, then both items need some sort of massive overhaul or something else added into the game that can give them practical use. As it stands, they are probably the 2 most useless store items in the entire game. Finally, the last thing I will be discussing is the solo experience. This is one I particularly care about as someone who has spent a decent amount of time playing the game alone, and I really don't think fixing this part of the game is even that hard. If you're good enough at the game, it's already entirely possible to play solo, but my main goal is to lower the barrier of entry so that playing solo can be comfortable for people who aren't necessarily good and just trying to have casual fun. One of the most obvious problems with solo play is the fact that a team wipe only involves one person's mistakes instead of 4, and to address this I would personally make it so dying doesn't make you lose all of the scrap on your ship, but instead you only lose whatever you gained on that day. Many other issues arrive from things that are impossible or inconvenient to deal with as a single player. For instance, it is physically impossible to have a terminal operator in solo, which makes turrets and powered doors bigger obstacles than they are intended to be. To address this, I would simply decrease the maximum number of turrets on every moon and make all powered doors default to being open. To ensure that players have a bit of an easier time being self-sufficient, I would also make it so that in solo only, shovels weigh less, so that people who want to fight monsters and defend themselves will have an easier time doing so. Either way, it would be similar to the way they were for everyone in V49 anyways. Another inconvenience for solo players are the Vein Shroud and the Kidnapper Fox. The way I would handle the Fox would be a similar approach as to what is used with Snare Fleas already. Rather than the enemy killing you outright, I think if it does capture you, it should put you on critical and then let you go. The Vein Shroud should also have a lower chance to spawn and have a maximum cap on how many of them can spawn, so that dealing with them in the first place is rare, but if you have to, it's not impossible. There are also 2 enemies which become massively more inconvenient if there is only one player to act as a target, those being the Butler and Ghost Girl. To address this, I would double the time it takes for butlers to aggro from 12 seconds to 24 seconds and decrease the maximum that can spawn on any given moon from 7 to 2. In regards to the Ghost Girl, the main stat that contributes to her progression is Insanity, so I believe simply scaling back on how quickly that stat rises and making the Ghost Girl less likely to spawn to begin with would solve the problem. With all of that said, I honestly think that's all it would take to balance the game for solo players. I wouldn't want the gameplay to feel very different from playing with other people, which is why I don't think any further changes are necessary. It just needs to be fair, not any easier. And with that, it seems like I've addressed all of the talking points. However, I think this whole topic goes far beyond the scope of what I alone am able to identify as an issue to criticize. There's plenty of stuff I could have just forgotten about, or maybe I don't think it's unbalanced, but you do. So if you guys have any thoughts of your own, I highly encourage continuing the discussion in the comments amongst yourselves. And in conclusion, Lethal Company is a game that, like any other, is not perfect. It has its faults. This is obvious. But despite this, I can safely say it is one of the best games I've ever played. And it is for that exact reason that this video even exists. I want to see the game get better, and I know Icicles is capable of responding positively to criticism and fixing things players have issues with because he's done it in the past. This video was a long time in the making, so I'd like to personally thank you for watching. If you'd like to give any further support, just sharing with a friend or subscribing would be greatly appreciated, but it's not necessary. That being said, my name is Minaxa, and that's gonna be all from me. I hope you enjoyed the video. Until next time. I'd also like to express my thanks once again to War Thunder for sponsoring this video. As a reminder, the game is free on PC, PlayStation, and Xbox. Use my link on sign up to get that big bonus pack, which includes an exclusive cosmetic, free in-game currency, and 7 days of premium. This bonus is only available for a limited time, so make sure you don't miss out on any of the action.